Welcome back to Face Facts Friday, where you will be diving into the Denmark Vesey story with Colorful Story. These will be the products I will be using today while we record Chapter 2. So in Chapter 2, it's called A Place Called Charleston in the Christian language. And the author begins to break down a little bit of the background for Denmark Vesey and the enslaver, Joseph Vesey, who was the captain at the time. So first, let's talk about the enslaver, Joseph Vesey. Joseph Vesey was this seaman who retired from the sea life in 1783 to become a retailer of enslaved Africans. About 1781, he was about 34 years old, born in Bermuda. He came from this background of a place where enslaved Africans was not the way to go. They really wanted to pride themselves in having white men being shipbuilders as something to be proud of. So they weren't big on enslaving black people for profit. Captain Vesey was an owner of slave ships for 13 years, and he obtained slaves from South Carolina, Haiti, and West Africa. Something interesting about him was he did something rare, which is outlived 4 of his wives, and he had multiple children. He also was one to utilize Denmark's capability of being bilingual as a way to turn profits in other parts of the world when he was trading slaves. Now, his position as a slave retailer and a former seaman got him very prominent positions when he moved to South Carolina. He was one of the prominent names for city government positions. And lastly, the census had him as owning 8 slaves, had 4 free people living with him as well as himself by the time they were all registered. Now, I know we're only in Chapter 2, but the vibes that I'm getting from Captain Joseph Vesey is that he allegedly treated his slaves well. I mean, how does one treat an enslaved person well? You are enslaving a human being, right? But I'm not getting any bad vibes from him yet. We got a couple of more chapters to go. Outside of him only enslaving slaves, the author doesn't seem to paint him in a bad light. Now let's get into Denmark. Denmark was originally named Telemaque, Telemaque. Telemaque was an enslaved boy who was 16 years old on one of the slave ships that Captain Vesey was sailing. And he often stood out to Joseph Vesey, and they met at around 1781. Now, get this. Telemaque was stand out to Captain Vesey by the way that he carried himself, and so he believed that he would probably be profitable. And so he was kind of like a pet to Captain Joseph Vesey in the beginning. But when he became profitable, or so he thought, he sold him to an enslaver in Cape Francis. However, what he did not think would happen would be that Telemaque would be clever, right? Here's what I mean by this. So Captain Vesey sold Denmark in Cape Francis, and it was to a sugar plantation. Well, of course, Denmark was like, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not about to be out here working in no hot sun doing all this other stuff. So this doctor came in, this French doctor came in and was like, oh, he has epilepsy. So the enslaver that bought Telemaque was like, I want my money back. So when Captain Vesey came back around, he was like, run me my ducats. I want a refund. And he refunded the money. However, what was interesting was Telemaque's epilepsy suddenly disappeared when he no longer worked the sugar plantations. Those tactics will come into hand very, very soon. It's because of this that Telemaque began to get respect from other slaves watching. And in some ways, his linguistics ability gained him respect among white people. However, we're going to see later on how much that trust is going to bite them in the butt. But anyway, the author goes on to say how Telemaque becomes Joseph Vesey's newest purchase, and he gets the name Denmark. And then a few years later in the 1800s, remember he was purchased in 1781, but in 1800 he purchases freedom from Captain Joseph Vesey. The author begins to shift gears a little bit and talks about the Middle Passage. Most of us are aware of the Middle Passage as the transatlantic slave trade, and most of our knowledge comes from school, and it doesn't paint a pretty picture of the transatlantic slave trade when you actually learn the truth. It's very watered down in school. So in the book, he discusses how sailors could smell whenever a slave ship was near, which had to be pretty bad. The author describes the slave ship, the average slave ship, as being unhygienic. Many of the enslavers and white sailors were very superstitious about these ships because of how the enslaved were treated while stored there. Most of us have seen the pictures of the stacks of black bodies on top of each other in these slave ships. And so some of them were dead while on the ship. So most white sailors would not want to be aboard these slave ships. And they refused to sail with these enslavers. One captain became so concerned with their slaves not surviving that they would literally throw them overboard while they were somewhat still alive. It got so bad that a Charleston newspaper started to report and complain about black corpses showing up on shore because they were tossing so many dead bodies out of these ships. The bodies were appearing on beaches and in marshes, and I didn't understand how they could be more upset with beaches and marshes being filled with black bodies than they were upset with the fact that there are black bodies just thrown away. So much for that, all lives matter, pro-life type of stuff. It doesn't seem very Christian-like, but then again, we weren't a Christian nation during this time. We still aren't. I find the idea of black bodies showing up on land to be very important because the author then shifts to the population. So the first census in 1790 had about 15,402 whites to 51,582 black people. But in 1800, around the time that Denmark Vesey freed himself, there were 18,768 whites, but 63,615 blacks. Charleston contained more black people than Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City combined at this time. 8 to 9% of the white population, however, controlled all of the wealth of Charleston, and it was mainly through slave labor. They also controlled all of the political power, so when it came to passing laws that would benefit the economy of Charleston at that time, people without color were the only ones in charge. Black people were the majority. They were the property, and they had no control over what happened to their lives. Sound familiar? So a police force was put into place during this time. And They got creative in what they wanted to enforce, right? So they forbade any black people of wearing fine clothes in the daylight, smoking a cigar, playing musical instruments such as a drum. You know, that's why we're always on the 2 and 4, and some people are always on the 1 and 3, but another day, another conversation. Carrying a walking stick, because why would you want your property to have any protection from you? A young black boy would be sent out to beat a drum to notify black people when it was time to leave the streets before the lights went out. Sounds familiar? Just think before the street lights came on. Any black person caught outside without permission would be jailed and beaten until their enslaver would come get them. They would be sent to this place called the Workhouse. And most enslavers would send their enslaves here to be whipped and beaten whenever they got out of line. Also, some enslavers would be upset because in some cases their slaves were being kidnapped and being taken to the workhouse just because. And they had to pay to get them out in some cases. Now let's talk white fear, because that population that I mentioned is going to play a huge role. In Charleston, although it contained the largest black population in the US at the time, but also the largest amount of enslaved Africans who came directly from Africa, it wasn't as beneficial to white enslavers and the white population as they thought. A lot of the enslaved Africans who were there at the time were Angolans, Igbos, and Gambians, who were considered the most suitable slaves for the South Carolina's climate and agriculture at the time, right? However, most who came from these different groups were warriors in West Africa. It's also important to note that during this time, that these particular groups were in charge of the markets that sold all of the produce that they were picking for the enslavers at the time. And this caused white fear too, because they thought, wow, so we own the blacks, but they're in charge of our produce, what we can and cannot have. I don't like that. How can they control the ports? Now, remember that job that I was telling you that Joseph Vesey had as a top city official? Well, he got the contracts for construction and financing in the markets. And Denmark was one of his slaves, which will be broken down further in upcoming chapters and how that played a role in the insurrection. Because the market will become a place for Denmark and his accomplices to meet in 1822, the night of the insurrection. Lastly, the author talks about religion and how the Islamic faith and Christianity played a role, because those were the two prominent religions that enslaved Africans had at that time. It was interesting how many enslaved Africans were able to bring their faith in Islam to the Americas after being captured and enslaved in the Americas. They were still able to practice. Now, this also led to more white fear. And chapter 3 goes into a little bit more detail surrounding the faith and how it played a role in the insurrection. So I'm so glad that you guys joined me this evening. I want to know your thoughts. What are you thinking about Denmark so far? Is it still too early to tell if he's a hero or a villain? Let me know in the comments. I'll see y'all next time for chapter 3. Have a good night.